Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The hum of the air conditioner in Samto Okuri's classroom seemed louder than usual that morning. Its low vibration pressing against the back of his skull as he sat in the third row, clutching the reading book the teacher had just placed on his desk. His fingers curled around the edges, the pages smelling faintly of fresh ink and dust, but his eyes blurred over the black letters. He knew this ritual all too well. The teacher, Miss Adebayo, picking students at random to stand and read aloud to the class. But Samto was never truly random. Every week, she called on him, perhaps hoping that forcing him to read in front of others would finally shake the shame out of him. In reality, it only tightened the knot in his stomach. Today was no different. Her voice rang out. Samto-chukwu, your turn. Page 22, paragraph 3. He felt his ears heat, the stares of 22 other pupils drilling into him. His lips moved, but the letters wouldn't stay still. They danced and switched places, turning into a jumbled code only his mind seemed cursed to see. He swallowed hard, started with a word he thought he recognized, stumbled over the second, and by the third his tongue betrayed him, twisting the sounds until the classroom erupted into giggles. A boy in the back row made a loud, mocking echo of his mistake. Another whispered something that made the girls in front snicker. Samto's chest burned. Miss Adebayo tried to shush them, but the damage was done. The sound of laughter didn't just fill the room. It pressed against Samto like a wall, hot and humiliating. His eyes darted to the door, every muscle in his body urging him to escape. He dropped the book onto his desk with a clumsy thud and muttered something inaudible before pushing back his chair so suddenly that it screeched against the tiled floor. The teacher's voice followed him, calling his name, telling him to come back. But the heat in his cheeks, the pounding in his ears, drowned her out. He burst into the corridor, his school shoes striking the linoleum like drumbeats, weaving past lockers and startled students. By the time he reached the gate, the security man called after him, but Samto slipped past easily. He knew the route. The school driver, lounging by the car park, hadn't noticed him. He kept walking, faster, faster, until the sound of the school faded and the world beyond the gates swallowed him. His legs moved on instinct, cutting through a street lined with small shops, past a mama put stall with steaming pots, and toward the one place he thought no one from his school would follow, the public library. When he finally reached the library, a squat building with peeling green paint and a sign that had seen better days, his chest was still heaving, his palms damp. Inside, it smelled of old paper and faint mildew. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly, and only a handful of people sat scattered at the wooden tables. In the far corner, near the wall of outdated encyclopedias, he spotted her. She sat with two much younger children, both bent over tattered exercise books, while she pointed at their work with a stubby pencil. Her clothes were faded and mismatched, the hem of her skirt fraying. A plain scarf covered her hair, and her sandals looked worn enough to have walked 100 miles. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, her eyes alert, steady, not pitying. For a moment, he hesitated. She was a stranger, and everyone always said to avoid those street people. But there was something in her gaze, a quiet, unhurried patience, that made him take a step closer. That step would change everything. Chioma had long grown used to the way people avoided her. In the market, women would pull their children closer if she happened to be standing too near. At bus stops, men would glance at her frayed skirt and tattered scarf and decide she wasn't worth the trouble of conversation. Even in the library, one of the few places she could sit without being asked to by something or leave, she could feel the invisible barrier between her and the rest of the world. She was 24, but her eyes carried the weight of someone twice that age. She'd been living in the women's shelter for 3 years now, a place where mattresses were thin and privacy was a luxury, but it was still safer than the streets. Her small corner in the library was her kingdom, 1 wobbly table, 2 wooden chairs, and the small pile of handwritten worksheets she used to tutor children from the neighborhood. It was unpaid work, but it filled her mornings with purpose. That day, she was deep into a reading exercise with Amina and Tope, two siblings who could barely afford school fees, when the boy appeared. His uniform was neat, expensive-looking, his shoes polished. But his face was blotchy, his eyes red-rimmed from either anger or embarrassment, and his breathing was uneven. He hovered for a moment, as though torn between staying and bolting for the door. Chioma saw something in him she recognized, the look of someone on the edge of breaking, someone who just had the air punched out of their confidence. Without thinking, she nodded toward the empty chair beside her. "Sit if you want," she said simply. He sat down, stiffly at first, keeping his eyes on the floor. She didn't ask questions. She knew sometimes silence was the safest place for a person to land. Instead, she slid a thin, colored strip of transparent plastic over a page in an old children's reader and pushed it toward him. "Try this," she said. He looked puzzled, but leaned forward. The colored strip made the letters stop swimming across the page, and slowly, haltingly, he began to sound out the first line. His voice shook, but he reached the end of the sentence without the words tangling in his mouth. Chioma gave him a small, matter-of-fact smile. "Not bad," she said. No exaggerated praise, no disbelief, just quiet acknowledgement. Samto's lips twitched in something like relief. For the first time in months, he'd read a sentence, without feeling like the room was watching for him to fail. Chioma didn't tell him how to sit, didn't rush him to the next page, didn't remind him that he had so much catching up to do. Instead, she let him linger over the same sentence, testing the words until his tongue grew comfortable around them. When Amina and Tope finished their exercise and left, Samto stayed in the chair. Chioma offered him a sip from her bottle of water, and he accepted. He didn't tell her his name yet, but when he left the library, he glanced back at her once before disappearing through the doors. She had no way of knowing he would return. The next afternoon, Samto lingered in the hallway outside his classroom until the school bell rang, then slipped away before the driver could find him. He wasn't sure why he was doing it, skipping the car ride home, dodging questions, except that his mind kept drifting back to that corner table in the library, to the strange calm that had wrapped around him there. His steps were quicker today, more purposeful. When he pushed open the library door, the faint scent of old books met him again, along with the soft scratch of pencils and the murmur of quiet voices. Chioma was there, bent over a stack of papers, her scarf a slightly different faded print than yesterday. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face before she nodded in welcome. "Back again?" she asked. He nodded, but didn't elaborate. She didn't press him. Instead, she pulled out another reading strip and a new book, not a textbook, but a story about a boy and his mischievous goat. The humor in the simple sentences drew out a reluctant smile from Samto, as he stumbled less and less over the words. When he got one right, Chioma would simply mark it with a pencil tick, not making a fuss, letting the quiet pride settle in him on its own. Between readings, she told him about how she sometimes helped children from the shelter with homework, even though she never finished her own schooling. She mentioned her brother once, in passing, her voice hitching almost imperceptibly before she moved on. Samto didn't ask for details. He only knew he liked listening to her talk. As the session ended, Samto realized he didn't want to leave. Outside, the afternoon sun had softened, casting a warm glow through the dusty library windows. Chioma packed up her worksheets into a plastic folder, her movements unhurried. For the first time, he noticed the small tear in her scarf, the way her fingers were calloused. She caught him looking and smiled faintly. "See you tomorrow?" she asked. Samto didn't answer out loud, but the nod he gave was certain. As he left the library, he felt something unfamiliar, anticipation, maybe even hope for the next day. For the first time, the idea of reading didn't fill him with dread. And somewhere deep inside, he sensed that this woman the rest of the world overlooked might just be the one person who saw him clearly. Ken Oaky had long believed that his son's academic struggles were a matter of laziness or distraction. He had paid for the best schools, the best lesson teachers, the best materials. And yet, Samto's report cards kept bringing back the same red marks in English and reading. That Tuesday afternoon, when the school driver called to say he couldn't find the boy anywhere on the grounds, Ken felt the first prickle of irritation and worry. Meetings were postponed, his car was turned around, and within half an hour, he was retracing streets he barely noticed most days. The driver mentioned seeing Samto heading toward the public library, an odd choice for a child who claimed to hate reading. Ken pushed open the peeling green door of the building and was greeted by the faint smell of dust and worn paper. His eyes swept the room quickly, passing over students, a few elderly men, and then landing on a corner table. There sat his son, leaning forward, a finger tracing words in a book, and next to him, a young woman with a faded scarf and worn clothes. Guiding him with a calm focus Ken hadn't seen from any of the private tutors he'd hired. The sight stopped him mid-step. Ken's first instinct was suspicion. He'd seen women like her on the streets, hanging around bus stops, begging or peddling cheap goods. She was too young to be his son's teacher, and her appearance, the frayed hem of her skirt, the cracked screen of her phone resting on the table, made him uneasy. What was her angle? He took a step closer, close enough to hear the low murmur of her voice as she corrected Samto gently on a misread word. Samto's eyes were fixed on the page, a small crease of concentration between his brows, and then, unexpectedly, a smile broke across his face when he got the sentence right. Ken froze. It wasn't a polite, forced smile for an adult's approval. It was the kind of smile Ken hadn't seen in months, pure, unguarded, like a small window into the boy he used to be before reading became a source of shame. Ken's irritation faltered, replaced by something he couldn't quite name. When Samto finally noticed him, his eyes widened, a flash of guilt there. But before Ken could speak, his son blurted, "Dad, she's helping me. I can read better now." The homeless-looking woman rose slightly, out of habit or politeness, but didn't fawn over him the way others usually did. "Good afternoon, sir," she said simply, her tone even, unthreatened. Ken studied her face, not conventionally beautiful, but striking in a quiet way, her eyes direct and without apology. "And you are?" he asked. "Chioma," she replied. "We were just finishing up." His gaze flicked back to Samto, who was holding the book like it was something valuable, not the enemy it had been last week. There was a brief, awkward silence before Ken nodded curtly and told Samto to get his bag. On the way out, he glanced back at her once more, unsure why her presence unsettled him so much. Later, as they drove home, he asked his son why he hadn't told him about her. Samto's answer was simple, almost defiant, "Because you'd have stopped me, and I need her." That was the first time Ken realized this wasn't just another tutor. This woman had reached his son in a way he hadn't thought possible. That evening, Ken found himself pacing his study, his mind returning again and again to the image of Samto reading in that dimly lit corner of the library. The boy's eyes had been alive, engaged, free of the defensive shrug Ken was used to seeing whenever reading was mentioned. He poured himself a glass of water, sat at his desk, and stared at the long list of contacts for professional tutors he'd cycled through over the years. None of them had achieved what that ragged-looking young woman had in what seemed like 2 afternoons. Against his usual instincts, he decided to speak to her directly. The next day he returned to the library after work, ignoring the faint surprise in the librarian's eyes when he asked for the young woman who teaches children here. Chioma looked up from her table as he approached, her expression unreadable. She didn't stand this time, just waited. "I'd like to hire you to tutor my son," he said without preamble. "At our home. Whatever you're doing is working." She blinked, clearly not expecting that. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," she replied, her voice cautious. Chioma explained that leaving the shelter for work in a rich man's home wasn't simple. People already looked at her with suspicion. Walking into a mansion every day would invite more gossip, and gossip could be dangerous for someone with no family to defend her. Ken assured her she'd be treated fairly, but she shook her head. "It's not just about fairness, sir. It's about trust on both sides." It was then that Sister Agnes, who had been standing quietly at the library door, stepped forward. "Chioma, this is a chance. Not just for you, but for the children you help. Think what you could do if you had the means." Chioma's jaw tightened. She didn't like feeling cornered. But the memory of Samto's smile as he read a sentence cleanly made her hesitate. Finally, she said, "I'll do it, but only if Samto still comes here sometimes." The library is where he started. Ken agreed, a little surprised at her firmness. The first day she arrived at the Oaky mansion, Chioma felt the walls close in. The gleaming marble floors, the art on the walls, the scent of polished wood. It was another world. One she'd only glimpsed from the gates of houses she passed on long walks. The staff eyed her as she was let in by Musa, the driver. Some whispered, others stared openly. She heard a voice from the top of the staircase, a woman in a silk robe, looking her up and down with undisguised disdain. "Ken, who is this?" the woman asked sharply. Chioma's spine straightened, but she said nothing. Ken's voice was clipped. "Tenny, this is Santo's new tutor. She's here because she's the only one who's helped him." Tenny's eyes lingered on Chioma's worn sandals before she turned away without a word. Chioma swallowed the sting of it and followed Santo to the study, determined that no matter how hostile the walls of this house felt, she would not let the boy down. The Oaky mansion was a palace compared to the shelter where Chioma slept each night, and yet she felt more at home on the cracked tiles of the library floor than on the plush carpet of Santo's study. Every day, she arrived at the gates to the same wary glances from the security men and the faint, disapproving murmurs of the staff. In the kitchen, she overheard one maid mutter, "Street people don't belong in places like this." Chioma learned to keep her head high, but the sting of their words stayed with her. Santo noticed, too. "Don't mind them," he whispered once, leaning close over his workbook. "They don't know you like I do." It was in these small moments that their bond deepened, not in grand breakthroughs, but in the steady rhythm of lessons, patient corrections, and shared victories when a sentence came out right. Tenny, Ken's fiancée, made no effort to hide her disapproval. She would accidentally walk into the study during lessons, smiling sweetly at Santo, but letting her eyes flick to Chioma with a look that said, "I'm watching you." At dinner, Chioma once overheard her telling Ken, "You can't just bring anyone into this house because Santo likes her. You have to think about appearances." Ken had replied curtly, "I'm thinking about results." And she's delivering. Still, the tension was thick. Chioma learned to measure her words carefully around Tenny, knowing one wrong move could get her sent back to the shelter and take her away from Santo, who was finally beginning to enjoy learning. Yet amid the coldness of the house, there were small, warm moments. Santo began leaving her little notes in his notebooks. "I read this whole page without help," or "This is my favorite story." Ken, though still formal with her, started lingering in the doorway during lessons, watching as his son's confidence grew. Once, when Santo successfully read a tricky paragraph, Ken caught Chioma's eye and gave a brief nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of her impact. Chioma didn't smile back. She just returned to the lesson, but inside, she felt something shift. She was moving between two worlds, the polished, suspicious mansion and the rough, accepting shelter. And though neither truly felt like home, one boy's progress was enough to keep her walking that line. Chioma learned quickly that progress with Santo was less about pushing him forward and more about protecting his small, fragile victories from being trampled. She stopped using the mansion's glossy workbooks with their crowded fonts and tiny margins, noticing how the dense pages made his eyes dart and his breathing shallow. Instead, she hand-copied short stories onto wide-ruled sheets, spacing the lines generously and using a simple, rounded script that didn't fight him. She introduced a ritual they repeated every day. They began with 1 minute of relaxed breathing, then a warm-up of decoding nonsense syllables he could not memorize by sight. Dap, leb, sorn, so he would trust his ear more than his shame. She cut colored strips from old plastic folders and let him choose a shade to lay across the line he was reading. She taught him to trace words with his finger while muttering, slow as fast, and when his eyes slipped, she gently tipped the page to guide him back. When he stumbled, she didn't say wrong. She said try again and waited. She was relentless about sound-out strategies, but merciful about time. A session could spend 20 minutes on 3 sentences, if that's what his brain needed to feel capable. On some afternoons, when the house was too loud or Tenny's perfume clouded the hallway like a warning, she took him to the back garden, where they read sitting on the low step beside a raised flower bed. The gardener, a soft-spoken man who listened to Fuji on a small radio while pruning hibiscus, began nodding at them as though he understood that a different sort of growth was being tended among the petals. With the words slowly losing their power to humiliate him, Santo began to talk, and when he talked, the grief that had settled on him since his mother's death loosened enough to move. He told Chioma that he barely remembered his mother's voice now. What he remembered were the textures, her gelly wrapping his cheek, the smell of fried plantain on Saturdays, her laughter when he mispronounced the name of a dinosaur and made it sound like a Yoruba uncle. He confessed that since she died, every teacher's sigh sounded like a verdict that he would never be enough. He told her how the lesson teachers at home would arrive with sharp pencils and sharper smiles, promising to fix him like a broken device, then leave, defeated, after a few weeks of blaming him for not trying hard enough. "I tried," he whispered once, angry tears surprising both of them, "but my eyes don't listen to me." Chioma didn't give him a speech about resilience. She handed him a soft cloth from her bag to wipe his face, then slid the colored strip back over the line and asked if he wanted to try again. He nodded, and he read, and, after, they sat for a long quiet minute. In that silence, trust braided itself without fanfare. The boy began to believe she would not abandon him at the first sign of difficulty, and she began to believe that his mind was not an insoluble riddle, but a console that needed a different set of controls. Outside the mansion, Chioma's life refused to transform just because she had gained access to a rich house. The shelter remained a humming nest of survival. Women sharing hair cream and rumors, toddlers tottering between bunks, Sister Agnes breaking up quarrels, with a wooden spoon tapped against her palm like a bell of order. Chioma still ate jollof from foam packs at the end of long days, still hid her small savings in a folded sock stuffed into the lining of her pillow. On her walk from the bus stop each morning, she felt the gaze of shopkeepers slide over her like rain, familiar, dismissive, sometimes wary. When she queued for kerosene, a woman behind her muttered, "These library girls, always pretending to be teachers," and Chioma pretended not to hear. Yet the work with Santo warmed a place in her that had gone cold for years. On one evening, when the shelter's generator coughed out and the room fell into humid darkness, she sat on her bunk and penned a story for him about a boy who thought the letters were ants dancing on a page. In her version, the boy befriended the ants, learned their pattern, and taught them to march in a line he could follow. She folded the paper carefully into her bag. The next day, when he read it slowly, with a grin that faltered and then held, he looked up at her as if she had crawled into his head with a torch and a map. "You're the only one who gets it," he said. Chioma wanted to tell him that being seen was a kind of food, that his little triumphs were feeding a starved part of her. But she kept it simple. "We'll keep going," she said. And they did. The sabotage did not begin like a movie twist. It began like a nuisance. One afternoon, Chioma opened the canvas tote where she kept her hand-copied stories, decoding cards, and colored strips, and found that the plastic folder with Santo's custom sheets was missing. She retraced her steps through the mansion, the hallway bench where she often paused to reassemble her materials, the kitchen where a friendly steward sometimes offered her water, the study where she stacked sets by chapter. Nothing. She asked softly at the staff quarters, where a few maids were scrolling on their phones, for faces turned at once and then away again. "Haven't seen it," one said too quickly. Chioma swallowed the prickle of suspicion and improvised, writing new lines while Santo sharpened a pencil to a nub. It wasn't fatal. She had backups at the shelter. But the next day, the narrow pencil case that held her overlays was gone. Then, a week later, the small notebook where she tracked which words tripped Santo most often, her roadmap, vanished from the study drawer. Each loss forced her to rebuild her tools. She adjusted, even improved some materials in the process, but the pattern felt deliberate, like a finger poking a bruise to see if it still hurts. The whispers grew louder in corridors she could not avoid. As Chioma walked past the dining room, she overheard a clipped laugh and the tail of a sentence from Tenny, the fiancé whose silk robes appeared at the top of stairs like flags. You know how these girls from the street are, always looking for a soft landing. A housemaid, eager to please, giggled sycophantically. Later, near the service entrance, Chioma caught two staff discussing a rumor that she had been spotted leaving a man's car late at night near the shelter. The lie crawled easily because she was poor and unprotected. When she pivoted into the kitchen for a glass of water, one steward, a kind man in his 50s who sliced fruit for Santo, held her gaze longer than usual and slid the water toward her with a gentle apology in his eyes, a silent confirmation that he'd heard the nastiness and couldn't stop it. Chioma drank, thanked him, and returned to the study with the odd sensation of walking through molasses. Progress with the boy was quickening, but the house itself seemed to be tilting beneath her feet, subtly hostile, breath held for a misstep. She redoubled her boundaries to protect the work. She kept her bag on her lap during breaks, started carrying duplicates of crucial tools, and texted Sister Agnes to log the times she arrived and left the mansion each day, an informal alibi if anyone tried to smear her with something worse than gossip. With Santo, she kept the sessions cheerful and firm, because the boy had begun to pick up on adult atmospheres and give them names he didn't speak out loud. He asked her once, "Do they like you?" And she deflected gently, "What matters is that we like the work we're doing." But that same evening, as she waited for her bus by a kiosk, a car rolled by slowly and a window slid down. Tenny's eyes, cool and bright, met hers. The fiancée smiled with her lips, not her eyes, and said, "You're very dedicated, miss." "Chioma," she supplied. "Yes, Chioma. Just remember, proximity does not equal belonging." The car pulled away. The sentence thudded like a small stone in Chioma's chest. She turned back to the road, the bus's smoky breath gusting warm on her face, and reminded herself that belonging was not the aim. The boy's reading was. The boy's dignity was. That night, under the shelter's humming ceiling fan, she stitched new colored strips from a broken plastic file with tape and resolve, and promised herself that harassment would not teach Santo the lesson the world had tried to teach her. That effort is useless when you are unwanted. She would not let that lie take root in him. It was Musa, the driver, who opened the door to a truth Chioma had tried not to look at directly. The old man had a calm that made people talk to him the way they did to barbers and Okada riders, unguarded, as if the quiet hum of the engine absorbed secrets. One late afternoon, after a session where Santo read a page without a single backslide, Musa offered to drop Chioma at the bus stop. She accepted, too tired to protest the small kindness. As they rolled through late-day traffic, horns tooting like disgruntled birds, Musa asked, without turning his head, "Where did you learn to teach like that?" She smiled faintly. "From paying attention," she said. He nodded. A pause stretched, comfortable as old cloth, and then he said, "You mentioned your brother once, to the boy. He died at a construction site." The word "died" skittered across her skin even now. "Yes," she said carefully. "Years ago." Musa's fingers flexed on the steering wheel, the only sign of tension. "Forgive me if I overstep," he said, "but some of us here have long memories about which sites were rushed and which ones were safe. The one you described by the ring road with the scaffolding collapse." He flicked his gaze briefly toward her. "That was one of our projects." The car seemed to get smaller around them. Chioma's first thought was not anger, but the fragile confusion of a puzzle snapping into a new configuration. She had known her brother's site was part of a big developer's portfolio. The newspapers had mentioned a name once, in an article that vanished after a day. She had never connected it to Ken Oaky personally, because men like him floated above the human damage their companies could do, insulated by layers of managers and lawyers. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice steady by force. Musa nodded once. "I drove the engineers to meetings there. The schedule was tight, too tight. There were whispers. But I am only a driver." He pulled up at the bus stop and cut the engine for a moment, an act of intimacy, stillness in the metal womb. "Listen," he said gently, "the boy matters. You matter. If you want to look into it, do it with a clear mind. If you want to leave it buried, I will not blame you. But don't let anyone make you doubt what you know." Chioma tucked her hands under her thighs to keep them from shaking. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." That night, she went back to the small tin of keepsakes under her bunk, little things that poor people hold on to because memory is the only property no one can evict. Her brother's faded ID card from the site, a pay stub with a company's subsidiary name, Oaky Urban Works Logistics Limited, printed in small type. A photocopy of the incident report someone at the clinic had pushed into her palm when they were trying to tidy up the mess, hoping papers would soften grief. She laid them out on the thin mattress and felt a heat under her ribs that was not quite rage and not quite relief. The line from her life to Ken's company was no longer a haze of suspicion. It had become a narrow, walkable path. She did not tell Samto. He needed her attention, uncomplicated by adult battles. She did not confront Ken. Not yet. Instead, she began to keep small notes in another notebook. This one she hid in a plastic bag taped inside the lining of her tote. She wrote dates she remembered from hospital visits, names of site managers' nurses had muttered while complaining, the detail that the scaffolding had been erected by a subcontractor who had also disappeared. The next time she passed the site from a distance, she took a long route and stood across the road, watching men in yellow helmets move like chess pieces on the skeleton of a new tower. She stood until the sun slipped lower and the heat from the asphalt rose to her knees, and she felt not the thrill of vengeance, but the solidification of purpose. She could keep teaching the boy to read, and she could also teach herself to read a system that preferred the poor to remain illegible. Both were acts of literacy. Both were survival. They had not planned to go out that Tuesday. The lesson had been going well in the study. Samto reading a page and a half of the goat story, without the letters unhooking from their places, when the generator hiccuped and the lights blinked twice in the way that meant the housekeeper would soon call for technical people. Chioma suggested they take a short walk to clear his head, and Samto, thrilled by the novelty of being with her outside the mansion walls, tilted his head, asking with his eyes rather than his mouth. They took the back path that Musa had shown her, through a quieter residential lane, and then to the small market where women sold vegetables under umbrellas that looked like wide, faded flowers. Chioma kept a respectful half-step behind him to avoid gossip, but she was still the tattered-looking woman walking beside a rich man's child, and the market saw what it wanted to see. A woman selling tomatoes stared too long at Chioma's frayed scarf and pursed her lips. Two teenage boys snorted and nudged each other as they passed, one stage whispering, "See as she be," as if the words would bounce off her back like pebbles. Samto, who normally kept his gaze fixed on the ground in public, looked up at her to check whether she had felt it. She had, of course she had, but she lifted one shoulder lightly as if shrugging off rain. They bought boiled groundnuts and suya from a man who recognized Ken's son and tried to undercharge out of clumsy respect. Chioma insisted on paying the full amount and left the change on the table, a small act of dignity she could control. It should have been a short outing, full of ordinary things. Instead, it became a lesson in cruelty. They reached the kiosk where a woman sold notebooks and cheap pencils, the kind Chioma bought in stacks for her church hall reading circle. The woman behind the counter knew Chioma from those purchases. She had once accused her of reselling donated items and threatened to call the council if Chioma didn't leave quickly. Seeing her with Samto now turned old contempt into new entertainment. "Ah, Madam Teacher," she said loudly, as if announcing a breaking news bulletin. "See you now, walking with big people. Luxury life don't start ABI." A few customers turned, eyes curious, mouths already ready to smile. Chioma replied evenly, "We are buying some pencils, please." But the woman was not interested in a sale. She wanted a scene. Pencils? For what? To sign checks? Or to write love letter to Oga? A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd. Chioma felt the heat of humiliation rise along her neck, but she would not give the woman the performance she craved. "5 packs, she said, laying money on the counter with a hand that refused to tremble. The seller wagged her head. "See this one, poor today, rich tomorrow, because she catch fish. Now, It might have continued, words layered on words like grease building in a pan, if Samto had not stepped forward. His voice, when it came, surprised everyone, including himself. "Stop talking to her like that," he said, clear and steady. "She is my teacher. She helps me read. You don't know anything about her." The silence that followed was not the soft hush of a library, but the sharp stilling of a market evaluating whether a boundary had been breached. A man by the phone charging stall laughed once, short and derisive. "Aha, small boy don't fall in love." A woman with a baby on her back snorted and said, "Which kind teacher homeless?" The words were familiar weapons, the kind Chioma had learned to absorb without flinching, but hearing them thrown at her while Santo stood there, chin lifted like a small shield, tore something tender open in her. Before she found an answer, a black SUV rolled to a slow stop by the curb. Ken stepped out, wearing the company casual uniform of power, rolled sleeves, watch glinting, expression unreadable. He had been finishing a call nearby when Musa mentioned where the boy and the tutor had walked. Something in him had insisted he come. He took in the scene in one sweep, the crowd, the mocking seller, his son standing like a sapling in a storm. The seller, sensing the entry of someone who mattered in a way money makes people matter, brightened her tone. "Oga, we day Greedo. We just day play." Ken's eyes moved to Chioma, and for once his gaze did not slide off her worn clothes. He saw how carefully she was holding herself together, how much discipline it took to keep her voice even in the face of public disrespect. He turned back to the counter and said, "Voice flat enough to cut. We'll take the pencils." And an apology. The woman shrank a little but muttered, "Sorry," as if the word had bones that could choke her. Ken nodded once and put a steadying hand on Santo's shoulder, the gesture as much for himself as for the boy. As they walked away, he glanced back at Chioma, and in that look something altered, less a softening than a belated calibration. He was beginning to see not just the effect she had on his son, but the cost she paid to have it in a world delighted to spit at her. The scandal started like a rumor dipped in varnish, shiny enough to reflect anything you wanted to see. 2 weeks after the market incident, when the house had settled into a brittle routine, Tenny's silence sharpened to a blade, Chioma's materials now guarded like state secrets, Santo reading steadily. The abduction attempt unfolded in the mall parking lot with a choreography that would have thrilled a cheap filmmaker. Chioma had taken Santo to buy a new set of ear-friendly audiobooks they'd found at a discount shop. She preferred midday when the mall was emptier, but a delivery delay kept them until late afternoon. They walked to the car, carrying a small bag, talking about whether the goat in their story might be clever or just lucky, when a man in a baseball cap stepped between them and the vehicle. He smiled with lips only, a practice gesture that meant nothing. "Auntie, I beg you get the time?" he asked too close. Before Chioma could answer, another man was at her back, and a woman, because women in these formations lower the guard of onlookers, stood 2 cars away, phone angled as if texting. The first man's hand flicked toward Santo's wrist like a lizard's tongue, and he said, "Oya, come," still smiling, still faux-friendly. Chioma didn't think, she moved. Her body stepped between boy and stranger, her voice dropped to the register where warning lives, and she said, "Step back." The man's smile cracked. "Relax, we day play." The woman's camera lens pinched. The second man's shoulder twitched like a runner coiling to start. Security arrived, not because they saw danger, but because someone saw an opportunity. 2 guards materialized with the confident gait of people used to being late, but acting early. "Madam, what's going on?" one asked, eyes already assessing Chioma's scarf for sandals. The way people like her are easier to blame. "They tried to pull him," she said, pointing at Santo, who had gone very still. The first guard's eyes slid to the woman with the phone. She shrugged theatrically and said, "I saw her drag the boy here. He was crying." A small crowd formed with the speed of spilled water. The second man in the cap suddenly looked like a good Samaritan. "We just ask her, make she leave the boy. He no look happy." The script was neat. Poor woman seen near rich child. Someone heroically intervenes. A video, edited, context amputated, would later confirm the lie. Chioma felt heat collect under her skin, but kept her voice clean. "Call his father," she said to the guard, pronouncing Ken's full name with such precision that the guard blinked. "Call the driver. Check the CCTV. Check the dash cams. Don't touch me, and don't touch the boy." The woman's phone moved again, framing Chioma at an angle that made her look larger, harsher. So violent. The woman muttered for the microphone that would later snip out the mutter and leave the lie to float unchallenged. Musa arrived breathless, eyes already scanning for angles and exits. He put himself between Santo and everyone else with a quiet authority that made the first man step back without realizing why. He said nothing to Chioma. He didn't need to. He said to the guards, "This is the boy's tutor. She is with him by instruction of the family. Release the boy to me now." The guard hesitated. Rules are often loudest when clarity is unwelcome. Then Ken's number flashed on his phone. Musa had called him the instant the first guard sounded unsure, and the guard's posture changed mid-sentence. They were allowed to leave, but the footage the woman had already uploaded began its greedy spread before the car rolled out of the lot. The caption was obscene in its breezy certainty. "Street woman caught trying to abduct billionaire son. Hero bystanders intervene." Comments hatched like flies. By the time they reached the house, the story had been screenshot into permanence. Within 24 hours, a parent from Santo's school had forwarded it to the PTA group chat with, "Is this the so-called tutor? Dangerous." Others chimed in with the oily self-righteousness of people who crave a cause that costs them nothing. The head teacher called Ken with a kind of careful panic reserved for wealthy families. "We will need to review her access to campus." Tenny did not gloat. She created the careful space gloating would later fill, sighing, "It's sad, Ken. I warned you, proximity is not belonging." Vanessa, who had orchestrated the entire charade through a fixer she used for unpleasant efficiencies, kept her hands clean. Her text to Ken framed concern like velvet. "We must protect the brand. This woman is a risk. Handle it." In the shelter that night, Chioma's phone vibrated with messages she didn't read, and Sister Agnes sat on the edge of her bunk and said a prayer without closing her eyes. The meeting was as short as Ken could make it without being cruel. Cruelty was not his intent. But intent doesn't erase impact, and the impact punched clean through Chioma's chest like an iron fist. He asked her to come to the study before Santo woke. His voice on the phone clipped in the way that told her he was bracing for a thing he didn't want to do, but would do anyway. She arrived early, bag hugged to her ribs, eyes alert for ambush. He stood by the window rather than behind the desk, which would have made it a firing squad of furniture. "You know why I called you," he began, and she nodded once. The night had been long. Sister Agnes reminding her to breathe, Musa texting, "Keep your head. We will prove it." Her own mind playing the scene on a loop until even the true version began to blur. Ken said the board was concerned, that parents were on edge, that the optics were bad, that this was temporary, until the facts were sorted. He did not say what the word temporary meant in a world where poor people's reputations rarely survive a rumor's half-life. He did not say that part of him wanted to slam his fist into the desk on her behalf, and another part, the part that had learned to manage reputational fires with controlled burns, was already measuring the perimeter. "I have to suspend your sessions," he said. "Not fire. Suspend." He said it as if the difference was a life raft in the Atlantic. Chioma stared at the patterned rug for a count of 4 breaths, the way she had learned to do when panic rose like floodwater. "I understand," she said, because arguing in that moment would be begging, and she could not beg and remain herself. "Will you tell him?" she asked. Ken's jaw worked. "I think it's better I do." She nodded again, swallowed the salt that had jumped into her throat, and said, "Then please tell him the truth, that I didn't leave him." Her voice did not crack until the end of the sentence, and the crack made Ken flinch as if someone had slapped him. He wanted to explain the calculus, that investors had opinions about tutors now, that Vanessa's quiet text had already found its echo in a board member's controlled email, that he believed in due process, but knew the world believed videos over facts. None of those reasons would land as anything but betrayal, because they were. He said instead, "I'm sorry." She slung the bag over her shoulder, adjusted the scarf at her neck with hands she kept from shaking by force of will, and left the house before the rest of it woke, the dawn air cool against a face that burned. When Santo found out, the air in the mansion seemed to lose oxygen. Ken had practiced a speech on the way to his son's room about pauses and process, and how grown-ups have to fix problems before things can go back to normal. The boy listened with the still, hard attention of someone memorizing a map of betrayal. "So because people lied, I lose her?" he asked, voice small but sharp. "For now," Ken said, hating the words as soon as they left him. "We will sort it out." Santo shook his head slowly, like an old man refusing a drink. "You always say that," he whispered, not because Ken said it often, but because it was the adult promise that had become shorthand for "nothing will happen fast enough to help you." Over the next days, his progress slid like a new tile loosened by too much water. Sentences he had owned slipped away, and the shame that had grown quiet began to hiss again. He ate less, spoke less, retreated into his room with the softness of a creature trying to make itself too small to be hurt. At school, he asked to be excused from reading aloud and then stopped asking, letting the teacher mark him absent in spirit when he was present in body. Chioma did what dignity allowed. She returned to the shelter, took extra night shifts at a cash register where customers talked to her like a robot, and opened the church hall earlier than usual to any child who wanted to sit close to words without being laughed at. She did not text Santo because boundaries protect the vulnerable. She did not call Ken because pride protects the self. She did not cry in public because the city eats women who cry in public. But when Amina asked her softly, "Auntie, you will still teach us, right?" she smiled a real smile that hurt at the corners and said, "Yes. Sit." Today we read about a girl who teaches ants to march. And when the church bell from the building next door rang the hour, nobody could hear how her heart kept clanging long after the sound died. The days after leaving the mansion felt like being cast adrift into a world that hadn't noticed she'd ever been moored to anything. Chioma's mornings reverted to the familiar pattern of the shelter, waking before dawn to beat the queue for the single working bathroom, tying her scarf in the mirrorless corner she claimed as hers, folding her thin blanket neatly so the bunk's plywood wouldn't splinter her clothes. But the rhythm that used to feel like endurance now carried an echo of absence. A boy's laugh when he finally conquered a sentence, the sight of him tapping his pencil against his lip when he thought hard about a story. She threw herself into the reading circles at the church hall, arriving earlier than usual, unlocking the heavy doors to the smell of varnished pews and faint incense. More children came now. Word had spread about the auntie who makes reading less scary, and on good days they filled the benches. She bought more pencils than she could afford, telling herself that if her savings shrank, at least something was growing in its place. But even as she celebrated a child's breakthrough, her eyes sometimes drifted to the door, as though expecting Santo to walk in, his bag slung carelessly, ready with a question about goats or dinosaurs. He never did. Santo's absence at the hall was mirrored by a shrinking in her evenings. The cashier job at the small supermarket had seemed like a blessing when Sister Agnes's cousin offered it. A few hours each night at the till, counting coins and scanning tins of milk. But the fluorescent lights were harsh, and the constant beep of the scanner drilled into her temples. Customers barely met her eyes, sliding money forward without words, or worse, speaking in the slow, loud tones reserved for children and the uneducated. She learned to count silently between customers to keep from grinding her teeth. Nights ended with her trudging back to the shelter under the jaundiced glow of street lamps, clutching her earnings in a zippered pouch pinned inside her skirt. It was honest work, but it was not the work that made her feel alive. Teaching had been her way of pushing back at a world that had stripped her of so much. Without Santo in her sessions, it was as if she had lost both a student and a piece of herself. For Santo, life without Chioma was like walking through fog that refused to lift. At school, his classmates quickly forgot the mall incident and returned to their usual games, but his relationship with reading slid backward. The words began to swim again, and without Chioma's colored strips or patient voice, his frustration rose faster than his ability. He started avoiding eye contact with his teachers, mumbling excuses, and when they insisted he try, he would stare at the page until the letters blurred. At home, the mansion's silence felt heavy. Tenny filled the space with brittle cheer, offering him gadgets or treats, but he responded with polite detachment. Ken noticed the change, the slump in his shoulders, the shorter answers. But each time he tried to broach the subject, Santo retreated to his room. Musa was the only one Santo spoke to without reserve, often sitting in the front seat of the car on the way to school, asking quietly, "Do you think she's okay?" Musa would answer truthfully, "I think she's still teaching. That's who she is." Santo would nod, his gaze fixed on the road, thinking of a church hall he had never seen but could picture in perfect detail. Chioma at the front, a pencil in her hand. her voice steady, her patience endless. He wished he could be there instead. Musa had been watching the fallout of the mall incident with the driver's patience, outwardly neutral, inwardly cataloging details like times, faces, and routes. It was during one of these mental inventories that he remembered something important: the dashcam in the second security vehicle that had trailed them to the mall. Most days, those cameras were forgotten, their footage overwritten within a week. But Musa knew the guard who had driven that car, a man with a habit of hoarding files on a personal flash drive just in case. One evening after dropping Ken at a dinner meeting, Musa drove to the guard's modest flat on the outskirts of the city. Over cups of too sweet tea, they watched the footage together. The video was grainy, but it showed enough. Chioma walking with Santo, no distress visible, followed by the sudden appearance of the man in the cap and the woman with the phone. The guard's voice was low when he said, "This doesn't look like abduction. It looks like a setup." Musa asked for a copy and left with the drive in his pocket, his jaw set. The next morning, he waited for Ken in the driveway, handing him the flash drive without preamble. "Watch this," was all he said. Ken watched the footage twice, then a third time, his face tightening with each replay. The clarity of the setup was undeniable. But the real blow came when he recognized the woman with the phone. Her name was buried in a list of freelance media consultants Vanessa had hired for various brand protection tasks over the years. It was a connection so cleanly hidden it almost impressed him, almost. He called in a trusted IT specialist to cross-check her phone's metadata from public posts against Vanessa's known movements. The overlap was damning. As the evidence piled up, Ken's anger shifted from simmering to cold resolve. It wasn't just that Vanessa had sabotaged Chioma, it was that she had risked Santo's safety to do it. And beneath the rage was a second, more personal guilt, that he had doubted Chioma enough to let her go without a fight. He thought of Santo's question, "So because people lied, I lose her," and realized the answer had been yes. That was a mistake he could no longer afford. Tenny, however, noticed too, and unlike Santo, she didn't find comfort in it. Her glances at Chioma became sharper, her silences heavier. She began appearing in the study again, leaning against the doorway as though checking on Santo, but her eyes always tracked the space between Chioma and Ken. Once, when Ken left the room to take a call, Tenny stepped inside and stood close enough for her perfume to press against Chioma's skin. "You should be careful," she said, her tone sugar-coated but sharp. "Men like Ken are generous until they're not. Don't mistake kindness for permanence." Chioma didn't respond, not because she was intimidated, but because she knew arguments like that were traps. They pulled you into defending something you didn't need to justify. She returned to her notes, letting the silence answer for her. Tenny left with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. If Ken sensed the undercurrents, he didn't address them directly. Instead, he began small acts that made his position clear without confrontation. He walked Chioma to the gate after each session, even if it meant stepping away from calls. He insisted Musa wait until she was safely on the bus before driving away. He began attending part of Santo's lessons, claiming he wanted to see the progress firsthand. But really, it was to spend a little more time in her company, without making it an event. And Chioma, though careful not to read too much into these gestures, found herself lingering at the end of sessions, packing her materials a little slower, allowing the conversation to stretch. They still kept their boundaries, but the space between them was no longer just professional. It was something warmer, quieter, and for now unspoken. The walls began to close in on Vanessa faster than she'd anticipated. The dashcam footage Ken had used to clear Chioma's name was only the tip of the iceberg. Once the board authorized an internal investigation, Oaky, the company's compliance lawyer, began peeling back layers of Vanessa's tenure like old wallpaper. Safety reports doctored to meet deadlines. Subcontractors paid off to look the other way. Brand protection expenses with no clear invoices, many of which led back to the same fixer who had staged the mall incident. Each discovery tightened the noose, and Vanessa, sensing the inevitability, tried to pivot. She requested a private meeting with Ken, arriving in her usual crisp, white blouse, as though appearance alone could still command authority. Let's be reasonable, she began, sliding a folder across his desk. Inside were documents intended to implicate him as equally responsible, proof that he had signed off on the same project she had. But Ken didn't flinch. I already told Chioma the truth, he said. If you think you can use my guilt to save yourself, you've miscalculated. Her confidence wavered for the first time. She leaned back, crossing her arms. You're willing to let this company burn to protect her? The pronoun hung in the air like a lit match. Ken didn't answer her question directly. I'm willing to rebuild the company from the ground up to protect what matters, he said. And you stopped mattering the moment you risked my son's safety. Vanessa's mouth tightened. She stood, smoothing her blouse, but there was no grace in the gesture. Within a week, she was formally dismissed, her severance withheld pending the outcome of regulatory inquiries. The police arrived at her home one early morning, cameras catching the moment she was led into a waiting car, her face half hidden but unmistakable. The image circulated online within hours, the same accounts that once echoed her narratives, now dissecting her downfall with glee. For Chioma, the news was complicated. On one hand, Vanessa's removal felt like the lifting of a shadow that had hovered over the mansion since her arrival. On the other, it confirmed something she already knew. The systems that crushed people like her brother didn't crumble with one arrest. But when she arrived at the mansion the day after the arrest, she noticed the staff's demeanor had shifted again, fewer sidelong glances, more cautious respect. Tenny, however, was not softened by the change. That evening, in front of the staff, she announced that she was ending her engagement to Ken, framing it as a matter of different priorities. Her eyes flicked briefly to Chioma as she said it, the implication unmissable. Ken didn't contest her story, simply letting her walk away. And when the door closed behind Tenny for the last time, Santo exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The house felt different now, not entirely safe, but freer. And for the first time, Chioma allowed herself to think about what it might mean to stay. The first days after Vanessa's arrest were not triumphant, they were administrative, which is how real repairs begin. Ken stopped taking victory calls from investors who wanted reassurance that optics had stabilized, and started making harder calls to site supervisors and families whose names had lived in his files as case numbers. He invited a small group to a closed-door town hall in a community center far from cameras, where folding chairs scraped cement and a water dispenser hiccuped between sentences. No stage, no backdrop, no company logo. He brought a Oaky to explain, in plain language, what the company would change and how accountability would be measured. He brought Musa, who insisted on being there because he said a driver's presence puts people at ease. Weird, but true. When a woman described, in a voice gone hoarse from the repetition of grief, how her husband had left for a shift and returned as a form on a clipboard, Ken did not counter with statistics about workplace incidents declining year over year. He listened. He took notes in his own hand. He said the sentence he owed without decoration, I am responsible. Then he did the thing that turns an apology into a hinge. He produced documents authorizing a victim's trust capitalized from his personal holdings, not the company's, with payouts structured to cover school fees, rent relief, and small business microgrants that families could apply for without hiring a lawyer or learning corporate dialect. The trust panel, he explained, would include a widow chosen by the families, a foreman with 30 years on scaffolds, and a retired regulator who still took public transport. NDAs, a man asked, chin tipped like a dare. None, Ken said. Truth doesn't heal in silence. While Ken was restructuring the top of the ladder, Chioma was laying planks at ground level. Her church hall reading circle had overflowed onto the steps, so she approached the head teacher of a nearby public school with a proposal she had scrawled on scrap paper. A 3-week training for primary teachers on low-cost reading supports, colored overlays cut from plastic folders, letters printed on card for sand tray tracing. Slow is fast routines that dignified repetition. The head teacher, exhausted and skeptical, said, "We have no money for workshops." Chioma smiled. "I'm the workshop." She arrived with a plastic basin of improvised materials and a laminated 1-page cheat sheet. Laminated because the first version, printed on regular paper, had dissolved in sweat and rain on day 2. She didn't scold teachers for crowded classrooms or outdated syllabi. She showed them how to shift what was possible inside constraints. And when she needed 5,000 naira for bulk paper and a ream of lamination film, there was an envelope on the church office table with no signature and a sticky note. Materials, not logos. K, which she accepted, because refusing would have been pride masquerading as purity. She called the program Read Loud, because shame taught children to whisper, and because hearing a child read plainly into air cleared a room like prayer. On Saturdays, she folded benches into circles and trained teenage volunteers to be reading buddies. She chose Samto carefully and last, not because she favored him. She avoided even the appearance of that, but because he kept showing up quietly to arrange pencils and return books, and because modeling competence heals the self that once hid. Tenny, however, noticed too, and unlike Samto, she didn't find comfort in it. Her glances at Chioma became sharper, her silences heavier. She began appearing in the study again, leaning against the doorway as though checking on Samto, but her eyes always tracked the space between Chioma and Ken. Once, when Ken left the room to take a call, Tenny stepped inside and stood close enough for her perfume to press against Chioma's skin. "You should be careful," she said, her tone sugar-coated but sharp. "Men like Ken are generous until they're not. Don't mistake kindness for permanence." Chioma didn't respond, not because she was intimidated, but because she knew arguments like that were traps. They pulled you into defending something you didn't need to justify. She returned to her notes, letting the silence answer for her. Tenny left with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. If Ken sensed the undercurrents, he didn't address them directly. Instead, he began small acts that made his position clear without confrontation. He walked Chioma to the gate after each session, even if it meant stepping away from calls. He insisted Musa wait until she was safely on the bus before driving away. He began attending part of Samto's lessons, claiming he wanted to see the progress firsthand. But really, it was to spend a little more time in her company, without making it an event. And Chioma, though careful not to read too much into these gestures, found herself lingering at the end of sessions, packing her materials a little slower, allowing the conversation to stretch. They still kept their boundaries, but the space between them was no longer just professional. It was something warmer, quieter, and for now unspoken. The walls began to close in on Vanessa faster than she'd anticipated. The dashcam footage Ken had used to clear Chioma's name was only the tip of the iceberg. Once the board authorized an internal investigation, Oaky, the company's compliance lawyer, began peeling back layers of Vanessa's tenure like old wallpaper. Safety reports doctored to meet deadlines. Subcontractors paid off to look the other way. Brand protection, expenses with no clear invoices, many of which led back to the same fixer who had staged the mall incident. Each discovery tightened the noose, and Vanessa, sensing the inevitability, tried to pivot. She requested a private meeting with Ken, arriving in her usual crisp, white blouse, as though appearance alone could still command authority. "Let's be reasonable," she began, sliding a folder across his desk. Inside were documents intended to implicate him as equally responsible, proof that he had signed off on the same project she had. But Ken didn't flinch. "I already told Chioma the truth," he said. "If you think you can use my guilt to save yourself, you've miscalculated." Her confidence wavered for the first time. She leaned back, crossing her arms. "You're willing to let this company burn to protect her?" The pronoun hung in the air like a lit match. Ken didn't answer her question directly. "I'm willing to rebuild the company from the ground up to protect what matters," he said. "And you stopped mattering the moment you risked my son's safety." Vanessa's mouth tightened. She stood, smoothing her blouse, but there was no grace in the gesture. Within a week, she was formally dismissed, her severance withheld pending the outcome of regulatory inquiries. The police arrived at her home one early morning, cameras catching the moment she was led into a waiting car, her face half hidden but unmistakable. The image circulated online within hours, the same accounts that once echoed her narratives, now dissecting her downfall with glee. For Chioma, the news was complicated. On one hand, Vanessa's removal felt like the lifting of a shadow that had hovered over the mansion since her arrival. On the other, it confirmed something she already knew. The systems that crushed people like her brother didn't crumble with one arrest. But when she arrived at the mansion the day after the arrest, she noticed the staff's demeanor had shifted again, fewer sidelong glances, more cautious respect. Tenny, however, was not softened by the change. That evening, in front of the staff, she announced that she was ending her engagement to Ken, framing it as a matter of different priorities. Her eyes flicked briefly to Chioma as she said it, the implication unmissable. Ken didn't contest her story, simply letting her walk away. And when the door closed behind Tenny for the last time, Samto exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The house felt different now. Samto's contribution was small at first, stacking worksheets, handing out strips, demonstrating how to trace a word with a finger before attempting it aloud, but the smallness bloomed. The first time he read a paragraph in front of the Saturday group, his voice wobbled, then steadied when Chioma did nothing except lower her chin in that almost imperceptible nod that meant you got it. A younger boy in the front row, who had earlier muttered that reading made his chest feel tight, watched as if witnessing a magic trick he could learn. Later, while returning chairs to the nave, the boy asked Samto, "How did you stop the letters from moving?" Samto surprised himself with the grown answer that came out. "They didn't stop. I learned how to follow them." At school, the children who had laughed in the past tried a new angle. "Why are you spending Saturdays with that street woman?" But Samto's spine had acquired the habit of staying straight. "She's the reason I can read your nonsense," he said, not unkindly, just done apologizing. At home, Ken stopped asking broad questions like "how's everything?" and learned to ask specifics. "Which story did you and Chioma use today? Which words fight you now?" He made space in meetings to learn boredom-inducing but system-saving details. How long it took to get harnesses replaced, which foreman cut corners when no one was looking. He hired not consultants with British accents, but two old site hands who knew how to smell a lie in cement mix. Then he gave them the authority to shut projects when they sensed haste. When a board member warned him about the cost of delays, Ken said, "Grief is costlier," and meant it. The house felt different in notes not everyone could hear. Fewer closed doors, staff gossip softening when Chioma entered, Musa humming more often while he waited near the gate. On one evening, after a long session and an even longer town hall, Ken stood in the garden and watched Chioma laugh at something Samto had said about a goat who refused to be herded. It wasn't a lover's laugh yet, it was lighter, freer, the sound of someone whose work was finally allowed to reach daylight. He realized repair had a sound, and he wanted to keep hearing it. The proposal did not begin with a ring. It began with a timetable. Ken had learned that love which arrives wrapped in spectacle can leave the same way. So he planned the day the way he planned safety audits, down to the minutes between moments, leaving room for breath. He asked the librarian at the Peeling Green Library where it had started whether they could use the back room for a small reading event. The librarian, who remembered the morning a neat boy ran in with a storm behind his eyes and the tattered woman who sat him down and fed him calm, said yes and made a pot of tea as if for guests, not patrons. Ken invited exactly 9 people. Sister Agnes, who arrived with a bag of chin-chin and the quiet pride of a general who sees her soldier decorated. Musa, who pretended he'd just happened to be nearby. 2 teachers from Read Loud, the head teacher from the public school, who had said we have no money, Amina and Tope, the siblings from the earliest library days, and 1 carpenter whose son's trust fund grant had turned into a workbench sturdy enough to start a business. He told them it was a thank you gathering for reading mentors, and that part was true. He did not tell them he would ask the most important question of his life in the space where his life had changed shape. Chioma arrived last, because Saturday mornings belonged to Read Loud, and she would not leave early from a circle of kids who now waited for Saturday the way they once waited for cartoon hour. She entered with chalk under her fingernail and her scarf slightly askew, and when she saw the faces in the room, people from separate chapters of her story now sitting at one table, she startled into stillness. No banners, no cameras, no surprise violinist, just a stack of paperbacks in the center of the table and cups of tea sweating gently in the heat. Samto stood first, holding the goat book like a talisman. "I want to read," he said, not to prove anything, not to perform, just because reading in this room felt like blessing a threshold. He read the first page. He stumbled on a word he hadn't seen before, then corrected himself using the strategy he'd practiced so often that his body knew it better than his mind. When he finished, he looked at Chioma the way a map looks at a road that has carried many feet, grateful and grounded. Sister Agnes clapped once and said, "Amen," because sometimes literacy is a prayer answered with a pencil. Ken cleared his throat and walked to the center of the room. He did not kneel immediately. First, he spoke because promises need verbs. He said that the victim's trust was now incorporated with independent oversight and a published ledger, that worker representatives had been elected by secret ballot to 2 board seats, that a whistleblower hotline run by a union lawyer, not the company, had already shut down 2 hurry-up shortcuts at a satellite site, that his own salary had been cut in half and the difference sent to the foundation endowing Read Loud's teacher stipends for 3 years. "This is not charity," he said. "It's rent for the space my mistakes have occupied in other people's lives." When he finally took the ring from his pocket, it looked almost shy in its smallness, simple gold, no stone heavy enough to distort a hand's work. He knelt on the thin rug that had always tripped people entering the back room and said not loudly, "Chioma Nwosu, will you marry me?" The room held its breath. Chioma did not rush into the silence. She had learned that hurrying ruins scents and stitches. She looked around at the faces, Sister Agnes with her spoon-tap authority and soft heart, Musa with his driver's hands that had steered them through bad weather, Amina and Tope perched like sparrows who had grown new feathers, the head teacher whose skepticism had become partnership, the carpenter whose boy read labels, now, before cutting wood. Then she looked at Samto, who nodded once as if to say only if you want to, the noblest permission a child can give. She met Ken's eyes. "I won't stop being the woman from the shelter who sits on plastic chairs and teaches children with colored strips," she said, voice steady. "Read Loud must stay independent. No logos on children's faces. I will not be a brand. If you sign anything that endangers workers, I'll fight you, even if it means sleeping on a bunk again." She added, after a breath that trembled only slightly, "And love me like a person, not a savior." Ken's answer was immediate and soft, the best kind of ow. Yes, to all of that. He slipped the ring on. It fit like a decision that had waited patiently for the right hour. The applause was the kind people make when they feel relief more than excitement, quiet, sustained, the sound of muscles unclenching. The librarian wiped her eyes with the corner of a handkerchief and muttered about dust. Sister Agnes produced bottled malt from her bag like a magician making small, sweet miracles appear, and cups clinked. They didn't take pictures. Samto leaned into Chioma's side and said, "Can we read one more page?" She laughed, not the careful laugh of someone who knows she is watched, but a laugh that rolled out like the first clean wind after harmattan. They read. After, they walked outside into a noon that felt newly scrubbed. The road was the same, the potholes undiminished, the street sellers still shouting about mangoes in a basket woven with the same fatigue as yesterday. But the 3 of them crossed the patch of cracked pavement between library and car with a rhythm only they could hear, a boy matching steps with a woman who had taught him to follow letters that refused to stay still, a man matching himself to the work of being worthy of both. Later that evening, back in the garden, Ken asked, "Where should we live?" And Chioma said, "Where the work can live with us." So they agreed on an apartment near 2 public schools, close enough to the shelter that she could still show up on Tuesdays to tutor women who had never learned to read a hospital bill without shame. When the first night settled on that new home, they wrote the house rules on printer paper and taped them above the dining table. No shouting. Eat together when possible. Saturday mornings belong to read loud. Tell the truth even when it breaks something. Fix what breaks. Keep a jar for words we love. Samto added the first slip, March, because the ants in the story had learned to do it, and so had he. And when the lights went out briefly because the power company remembered it was still Nigeria, they sat in the gentle dark and recited by memory the first paragraph of the Goat Book, a small chorus that sounded less like an ending than the hum at the start of a better chapter. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.